Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. I've long noticed that there is a huge gap between variable aperture telephoto zooms like Sony's own 200 to 600 G lens and then the super telephoto primes that often cost well in excess of $10,000, but nothing that really fits in between those. I think Sigma has given us the solution, however, in their new 300 to 600 millimeter f4, and this is a DG-OS sport lens. That's right, we have all the way from 300 to 600 millimeters with a constant maximum aperture of f4, which actually matches the aperture focal length combination of many of those high-end primes, all in a lens that cost around $6,000 US. Believe it or not, that's a huge bargain when you add up a few of those prime lenses and realize you could pretty quickly get up to $40,000. But is this lens capable of providing the kind of performance that photographers in that range are looking for? Well, that's what we're here to explore. So let's dive in and let's take some pictures today.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
Now, this lens was loaned to me by Sigma Canada, but they have had zero input on my review, and they will not see this video until you do. All right, so let's jump into the build and features of this bad boy here. I had a unique opportunity when this lens was launched, along with some other Sigma products, to be there in Tokyo at the product announcement. And so because of that, I was able to see a little bit more of the behind the scenes of what actually went into this lens. And by the way, I did write an article taking a look at Sigma's factory in Aizu, Japan. It's a really fascinating place, and if you haven't checked that out, I will throw a link to that in the description down below. But this lens is their first of Sigma's, we'll call them a great white. So the first time that they have done this finish, and so this is their thermal insulating paint. I think that the whole insulating thing is maybe a little overstated in my opinion. I think that people love great whites above all because they look cool, they attract attention, and those that want to be more discreet, they're going to wrap them anyway in some kind of camouflage or whatever. But it's certainly, if at their first kick at the can, this is beautifully done. And it has their new design language in terms of their logo and their fonts, and it all looks really spectacular. And so I do want to give them a huge thumbs up on that because it is a beautifully executed package here. And you can tell that it is quality all throughout. This is maybe the most feature-rich lens that I personally have tested before. So we'll break that down by just kind of moving from the camera forward. And so kind of go through these logically. The first thing you're going to encounter is a drop-in filter holder here. So included with it is what they call the RFH21SE. So this it comes with just a standard kind of protection UV type filter. I don't know why that is actually needed considering it's at the back of the lens, but nonetheless, here it is. But you can replace that with any 40.5 millimeter filter. Now, right now, this one just has a little rotating knob that allows you to either lock or unlock it into there. However, there are two optional drop-in filter holders that you can get. One of those comes with a circular polarizing filter, the other with a variable ND filter, up to 7 stops. And that comes in addition with a little wheel on it where you can rotate it and thus rotate the circular portion to optimize the effect for whatever you're looking for. Now, you're going to pay anywhere between right under $200 to about $265, I think, dollars for the variable ND, so under $200 for the CPL, and then the $265 for the variable ND. But the bottom line is here that this is not designed to be used with front filters at all, because frankly, there really aren't front filters that are made to accommodate that. The diameter of the lens is 167 millimeters. There just aren't 167 millimeter filters out there. And so it doesn't even have filter threads up front. It's all going to be this drop-in filter. So yeah, that's expensive. However, it is probably less expensive and certainly far more practical than carrying around filters that would be that size if you were so inclined to want to use them. I suspect many people probably aren't, but anyway, it's there. Next, we have two banks of switches, one on either side of the lens. I'll focus on the left side first. This is kind of the more traditional bank of switches. It gives you an AF/MF switch. It gives you a 3-position focus limiter. It gives you a 3-position OS switch here, which gives you off position 1, which is the standard, 2, which is for panning. Underneath that, there is a custom switch, again, 3-position off, C1 and C2. Now, this is where there's a divergence in the path. I'm reviewing a Sony E-mount version of this lens. However, on the L-mount version of the lens, it functions as a first-party lens there, and so it doesn't have any of the restrictions that I'll detail that happen on the Sony side of things. So on the L-mount side of things, you actually can get a dock where you can program additional function into the lens. So there are more options as to what you can program to the C1 and C2 positions. On Sony, we don't have that option. So on Sony, this becomes 2 other optical stabilizer modes, and so one of those really focuses, so C1 will really focus on stabilizing the viewfinder, and that's giving what they call the dynamic view. It actually does a great job on that. More on that in just a second. The second is what they call a moderate view, and so it is more of an active mode to where it's not going to interfere as much with you moving around and tracking action, but rather it will focus on just stabilizing the image at capture. Now, you will get really great performance at capture, but you're going to have a far less stable viewfinder experience. So you might want to play around with those OS modes and determine what works best for you. Now, Sigma's OS2 focus algorithm and then their image stabilization system, optical stabilization, it is actually, I would say, probably the best that I'm seeing on the Sony platform right now. And that's better than first-party Sony lenses. I was rather unimpressed with the OSS on the recent Sony 400 to 800 millimeter G lens review that I did. It was only okay. This is definitely better. And so it's actually has a rating, which Sony's lens didn't even come with a rating, which told me that it wasn't fantastic. And so in this case, the rating is 6 stops at 300 millimeters and then 5.5 stops at 600 millimeters. Now, I don't know how that interacts with the in-body image stabilization of your camera. It's kind of an all on or all off. You can't test those systems individually. But I would say that you're probably not getting a lot of additional stabilization from the camera body, if any. But it is, nonetheless, it is still very effective. And so even at 600 millimeters, it's not hard to have a stable viewfinder, nor is it really all that hard to get fairly stable handheld video. As you can see here, for example, I think it's a great system. Now, on the right side of the lens, we have a unique set of controls that I haven't really seen something similar to before. And so these controls are designed to interact with this unique function ring that is at the front of the lens. And so this doesn't fully rotate. It's more of like a rocker. You can rock left, you can rock right on it. And so there is a set button here. If you push the set button, it will allow you to set a preset focus position. And so then if you just quickly, rotate the ring and you're in the set position or preset position, focus will immediately, instantly go to that preset position. So that can be really useful if you're shooting sports, for example. Maybe you're focusing on the pitcher or a home plate or something like that, and you can instantly return to that shot even if you've looked to other action. So that can be a useful application. The second application you can set here is what they call power focus. And what's interesting with the power focus, when that is set, You can rotate this ring, and you can rotate it at, it's kind of a variable speed. So there's two different speeds. So if you rotate a little bit, it will smoothly power through your focus options. If you turn it more aggressively, it will rack through that faster. And obviously you can go in either direction depending on how you rotate the ring. I found that to be really useful because if you're holding the lens like this, and so your natural position is you're stabilizing it out away from the body, you can reach up fingers and very easily rotate that. And so where I found that useful is, for example, if I was trying to shoot a bird that was hidden in branches, and focused it and immediately lock on the correct layer that I was looking for, I could use that to pull back focus into the proper layer of focus very quickly, and then I could revert to autofocus and it would lock on more appropriately in that. So that can be useful. You also have another switch that allows you to have a beep on or off, and that beep comes, and it's not loud anyway. I don't think it's a big deal, but there can be a mild beep there when you're setting the focus to let you know that you've set that focus. But if you're in an environment, maybe shooting wildlife, for example, where you don't want any sound, you can avoid that and turn that off. Next, we come to the tripod collar. It's a really, really well executed collar. And so it has a feature that I've actually never seen before, and that is on the back of the tripod foot. You actually have a switch that will allow you to turn clicks on or off. Now, when you have that set, what it will do is cause a click or a detent at the cardinal positions, top, right, bottom, and left sides. And that makes it easy to make sure that you're perfectly aligned in those positions. If you turn that click off, you could just freely rotate without any of those clicks, but you'll have to rely on the actual, engraved lines to line things up and make sure it's properly set. I actually really like this option. I think it makes it unique. Also, I like the fact that on either side of this, we've got anchor points for a carrying strap. The knob is really beautifully executed. And then I really love the foot here. You've got three different options for mounting positions on the bottom. It does have Arca grooves cut into it. And for the people that say that this weakens the foot so it can't support the lens, this is a 4-kilogram lens, and this foot does just fine. So I just don't buy that argument. And you can see here, even on this mini table tripod, I'm able to lock it on there without any kind of issue. And by the way, it's nice and stable here. I mean, if I point that down and lock this in place, yeah, it's a heavy lens, but you can see that it's not going anywhere. And so that is great. I appreciate that. And I'll also note that the balance point is actually really great on this lens. It made it quite easy to even line up my test chart. Even though this is a hugely heavy lens, I found that the fact that it locked, it has a great balance point, made it much easier to align. Again, easier than the 400 to 800G lens that I recently reviewed. One final feature that I really love about this is that we've got a textured and padded section on the top of that. So it makes it a much nicer place if you're carrying around the lens by the actual tripod foot like that. It just makes it a much nicer thing to grip. And so it's a little kind of ergonomic detail that they put some thought into and they really nailed. And so I appreciate that. After this, we have got first the manual focus ring, good damping, everything moves well there. And then we have got the zoom ring. This is an internally zooming lens, so I love that. There's about 80 degrees of rotation between 300 and 600 millimeters. I wish it was even smaller than that. I prefer on the Sony 200 to 600G lens, which I own. It's a shorter throw and you can just really instantly react. And it's a little bit lighter a weight than this. And so I prefer that. This is still nice, but I think around 60 degrees of rotation would have been even better. So you could easily do it in one wrist rotation without having to kind of exceed what is your natural kind of break point on your wrist. But it is, outside of that, it is nicely executed. Obviously, internally zooming, you're not gonna have to worry about zoom creep or anything like that. So all of that, I think, is nicely implemented. Up front here, we do have, again, in those cardinal positions, we have the focus hold buttons or function buttons, and those are redundant, so whatever value you've got set in the camera for that focus hold button to do, all of these will perform that same function. They're redundant, and so whatever shooting position you're in, there's one that is close to hand. Obviously, on a big lens like this, it's not gonna fall into like a natural position for your hand. And so probably, if you're holding the lens like this is gonna be the most natural. I do appreciate that, like even on this top one, they've got it not quite at like the straight upright position. It's canted just a little bit to make it a little bit easier to get your hand to it. And then obviously up front, we're tapering to this very big front element. Now, it's kind of cool here. They have that kind of rubberized front touch point on the lens itself, which we'll see that on lens hoods, but recognizing that sometimes the hood might not be on there and you're going to want to set the lens upright like that. It's also got that there. The lens hood here is huge. As you can see, this is the biggest lens hood that I've personally ever seen before. In fact, I measured the lens hood and it's 165 millimeters long. And so that makes it longer than a lot of telephoto lenses itself. It's got a tension knob that will lock it into place here at the bottom. It is relatively lightweight. You know, they usually use some carbon and fiber in these hoods to help to keep them lighter. And so it is very nicely done. Without that hood attached, the lens is 167 millimeters in diameter. That's 6.6 inches. And it is a whopping 470 millimeters or 18.5 inches in length, making it weigh in at 3,970 grams or 140 ounces. Again, I measured that lens hood. Then I measured how far this all sticks out from the camera body to the tip. If you've got the lens hood on there, you're looking at 60 centimeters. That is a full 2 feet of a lens sticking out in front of your camera. This is definitely a case of the tail wagging the dog when it comes to any of the Sony cameras you would have mounted to it overall. Now, I knew that teleconverters weren't going to work because Sony has imposed an artificial limitation on any third-party lens and teleconverters. So yes, I tested. I do own the Sony 1.4 times. It mounts fine. Everything powers on fine. You can see an image through the viewfinder. However, you cannot focus. And when I say you cannot focus at all. Autofocus is not going to work because it's limiting to where it won't allow those focus algorithms, that focus information to come through. However, because this is a mirrorless design, and even when you manually focus, it's still using the focus motor to move. You can't even manually focus because manual focus won't do anything because it is blocking the signal from routing through the camera body and back into the lens itself. So it is a total no-go, which is terribly unfortunate. Now, if you're shooting on the Leica L-mount version of the lens, you can use Sigma's 1.4 times and 2 times teleconverters on L-mount. Obviously, that adds a lot to the functionality. You can get up to 840 millimeters at f5.6. That's amazing. All the way up to 1200 millimeters at just f8. Still amazing. So, I mean, obviously, that would be very, very useful here on Sony, but it's not going to happen unless Sony changes their mind. Inside we have 13 rounded aperture blades, and here's what those blades actually look like loose before they're actually installed into the lens. You can see also that the design of this lens, there's all kinds of magnesium and aluminum alloy parts inside there. It is a truly robustly made lens. Minimum focus distance varies between the wide end, 300 millimeters is the wide end, and so you can focus as closely as 2.8 meters at 300 millimeters, and then at 600 millimeters, that stretches out to 4.5 meters. Now, you get a little bit higher magnification at 600 millimeters than you do at 300 millimeters, as you can see here, but what's interesting is if you dig into the literature, you actually get your maximum magnification at a rather odd 470 millimeters. Now, of course, 470 millimeters is not even marked on the lens barrel, so you're going to have to guess, where, oh, that feels something like it. I tried to do as close as I could. I came back at 462 millimeters. I said, close enough. But at that distance, you can see you do get a higher level of magnification. You also get good performance there. Now, the magnification isn't like macro level at all. It's a 0.17 times level of magnification. So, useful, but not incredibly useful. If you want a macro lens, I can tell you that this is not all that practical to use for macro, but it's not terrible for doing somewhat close-up work. Now, it does come with the carrying strap, but also this beast of a case right here. And speaking of carrying strap, this camera actually has straps for you to carry it like a backpack. It is nicely padded inside. It's got a nice collar to, make sure that everything is secure there. And so it is a nice setup, which I appreciate. Sigma does their cases really, really well, and that's certainly true here. So there's a lot to talk about in this section because there's a lot going on in this lens. It is, I would say, the nicest Sigma lens that I have ever tested. It's one of the nicest lenses I've ever tested, period. Now, autofocus comes via Sigma's HLA, which is their high-speed linear actuator motor. And obviously, this is their improved autofocus system. And it's needed in a lens like this that is going to require, obviously, those are huge glass elements, even in the focus group. And so it means it's going to need a lot of thrust to achieve proper focus. What I found out in the real world is that I had plenty of speed for acquiring subjects when it came to being birding or in shots of Nala or shots of kayaking, and I'll show you sequences all throughout this. What I found, as you'll see from these results in these bursts, is that on my Alpha 1, I was able to get very good, but not exceptionally good autofocus consistency. Not at the level what I would say that I could get on an equivalent Sony first-party lens. Reason for that is that while most of the time focus is very good, there will be little occasional front or back focus swings where autofocus just isn't nailing it 100% of the time. Usually it's within an acceptable range, but because depth of field is so small on a lens like this, you can really see even very subtle focus misses. And so overall, I found it to be very good. I would have no problem getting a number of keepers in any kind of burst, but when I'm showing them like this, where every frame is being shown, there are some misses there, and I just find that there are some Sony lenses where I can nail pretty much 100% of them. Autofocus sound is very quiet. You're not going to really hear any kind of focus in operation. Focus is smooth. And as we can see here, if I do a kind of a formal example, you can see that focus at 300 millimeters is pretty close to instantaneous, and it goes back and forth very, very quickly with good confidence. I move on to 600 millimeters, and there's just a little bit more of a lag moving from the foreground to the background subject. It seems a little bit faster, in fact, coming back, but definitely just a little bit of slowness. But overall, there is sufficient speed that I was able to shoot a variety of high-moving subjects with, I would say, very good results, just not perfect type results. But overall, for stills, I would say that autofocus is really excellent. And I think if anybody is using one of Sony's premium sports cameras, they're going to have no problem getting plenty of photos that they're happy with. Now, I do have to give the unfortunate caveat with any kind of non-Sony lens that if you're using a sports-related body, I'm shooting mostly on the Alpha 1 for this review, outside of my formal test, which for sharpness, I use the A7R Mark V. But my Alpha 1, I could shoot up to 30 frames per second with a Sony lens. I'm going to be limited to just 15 frames per second here, and that's true even if you're using a camera as fast as the A9 Mark III, which in theory can shoot up to 120 frames per second. It's still going to be just 15 frames per second with the Sigma lens attached. Now, obviously, if you're shooting the L-mount version of the lens, there is no such limitation, but there's also no such camera as an Alpha 1 or an A9 Mark III either, so it's a bit of a catch-22 there. Because of the abbreviated review period with the lens, I wasn't able to shoot maybe as much video as what I would like. However, I found that video overall was fine. You can see in these shots of seagulls that the shots are stable and focusing fine. When I did my actual formal focus pull test, I found that, again, much like we saw with autofocus for stills, that 300 millimeters tends to be a little bit faster and more precise. 600 millimeters just a little bit longer in the focus process. I did find at 600 millimeters that maybe it had a little bit more of a hesitation in finding its contrast subject on the distant. It was more confident when pulling back to the foreground subject, which was a little bit more obvious. In general, however, I felt like autofocus felt smooth and overall it seemed to track just fine. I think it'll work fine for those of you that are wanting to shoot long-range video that's going to get that uniquely shallow depth of field that you can achieve with a lens like this. So now that we've talked about autofocus, let's take a look at the image quality. I will give you my typical deep dive optical breakdown at the end of the video if you want that. This is an optical design of 28 elements in 21 groups. You knew it was going to be complicated, and of course it is. The MTF looks quite excellent. We've got a very linear fade, particularly at 300 millimeters, just a very gradual and very linear fade from a very sharp center to still sharp corners. 600 millimeters is just a little bit worse, and you can see there's a little bit less contrast, a little bit more divergence between the two axes that are measured in that MTF chart. However, even at 600 millimeters f4, which is technically the worst performance of the lens, you're still able to get very sharp, highly detailed images, so don't worry about that. Now, I will note, for those of you that are not familiar with telephoto lenses, whenever you're testing for sharpness, note that at long telephoto distances, there are tons of factors that can negatively impact image quality. If you're shooting across any kind of thermal pockets, it will cause some little waves of distortion. You don't really pick that up on short focal lengths, but on telephoto focal lengths where that gets compressed into the scene, you definitely will see those things. So just note that you're going to have to learn. These lenses require a lot more time investment to get good with them, or at least with a similar type lens. If you've invested and you know how to shoot well with telephoto, you're going to get great results out of this lens. Now, it will go from 300 millimeters on this end to 600 millimeters on the telephoto end, and you can see that gives you a lot of different framing options in between. Now, in terms of the actual optical performance, I found that the lens had just a very tiny amount of longitudinal style chromatic aberration at 300 millimeters, almost none at 600 millimeters. That's one thing that does improve on the telephoto end. I didn't see any issues with lateral style chromatic aberrations anywhere. What's interesting is that this lens kind of bucks the trend that we see with a lot of modern lenses, in that it does almost all of its correction optically. There's almost no need for any kind of correction profiles with this lens. Even when it comes to vignette and distortion, there is the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion on the 300 millimeter end, and ever so slightly, just one mark more on the 600 millimeter end, but they're both so slight, you won't ever notice that it needs correction. There's so little vignette that I could correct a little bit. I mean, when I say a little bit, dialing like a plus 13, but again, you would never notice it. This real world shot, for example, has received no correction. It's wide open f4, against a very uniform background. And there is the tiniest amount of vignette there, just enough to help to draw the eye a little bit. There's really nothing that needs correction at all. You can see at 300 millimeters, and now I've switched to the A7R Mark V, and so 61 megapixels. And I will give a caveat. I have to move my whole testing setup outside, so there are more factors that come in play, but it's just too long for me to test anywhere indoors that I have access to. But at the same time, I redid my test multiple times. I used a 10-second rather than 2-second delay just to make sure I tried to avoid as much vibration as possible. But outdoors, with a lens this big, even wind coming along can introduce a little bit of vibration. You just know it's not like shooting in an optical lab. So I think my findings are accurate, but you can also maybe take them with a tiny grain of salt as well because of that. However, wide open at 300 millimeters, I found that there was very good sharpness and a very good consistency across the frame. In some ways, I'm almost more impressed with the mid-frame and the corner performance because they are more uniquely good relative to the center performance, even if that is a little bit higher. I found that stopping down to f5.6 provided a little tiny bit of contrast boost and a tiny bit more at f8. By f11, you're starting to regress a little bit due to diffraction. Minimum aperture is f22, and on a high resolution body, you definitely see some softening due to diffraction effect on that. Moving on to 400 millimeters, I actually found that to be what I would consider probably peak performance in and around that. It is noticeably sharper and higher contrast than 300 millimeters or anything that comes thereafter. And so this is top of the heap. It's really, really exceptionally good. You can really see that in the corners, just how much better it is in the corners as well. At 500 millimeters, I saw slightly less contrast with more of a boost if you stop down. So between f4 and f5.6, I see a more noticeable contrast boost. It's still very good performance, even at 500 millimeter f4. However, 600 millimeters looks largely similar to 500 millimeters. So again, there's a little bit of an improvement that comes at f5.6, and even a bit more, I would say, that comes at f8. However, at 600 millimeters f4, it's still easy to get highly detailed images with lots of contrast, and of course an extremely shallow depth of field and a strongly blurred out background. And so if you're relatively close to your subject, I mean, you obliterate the background. But where the real value of a lens like this is relative to these slower variable aperture zooms is not just in the light gathering potential, though that obviously is huge, because that constant f4 aperture means that you can shoot in much dimmer lighting conditions and get higher shutter speeds. I definitely noticed that I didn't have to jack my ISO as much to get, a 1/1000th or more of a second shutter speeds, and so that I could really stop action. It was fantastic for that. And so, I mean, that's great. But the other area where that really gives you a benefit is that any of these long telephoto lenses, even if they have a maximum aperture of f8, if you're relatively close to your subject and the background is some distance away, you'll completely blur out that background. But where this becomes very valuable is if you're a long distance from your subject and the background is not so nearly far away, you can still have a nice subject separation from the background. At 15 meters, which is 50 feet, the depth of field at 600 millimeters f4 is still only 15 centimeters. That's 6 inches. And so that means you still have this little tiny depth of field. For example, you can see in this shot and about those conditions that the front seagull is in focus and one that's just a couple of feet behind it out of focus. And so that ability to separate a subject from the background is very unique, which means you're going to have much more pleasing backgrounds in a lot of real world environments. And so the background's going to be less obvious, the subject is going to be more prominent, and you're going to get those really high-end looking images that people pay the big bucks on these super telephoto primes to achieve. While I didn't point the lens right at the sun, which is not going to happen all that often. Anyway, I did shoot into some very strongly backlit situations where there's lots of glare coming off the water, and I saw no issues with flare. Contrast held up. I saw no ghosting artifacts. That's kind of more of a real world test anyway, and I think that the lens passed it very, very well. Optically, this lens is really, really fantastic. I don't know that it can necessarily quite match the performance of those super telephoto primes, which you wouldn't expect a zoom to be able to do anyway, but it is very close and much closer than you're ever going to get with a lens like a 200 to 600 millimeter, that style of lens that has a variable aperture lens. And as you can see, it's tiny. I mean, I never thought of the 200 to 600G as being tiny, but relative to this lens, it's tiny because of all that optical glass inside. You look at the front of the lenses, and there's more than twice as much glass on this lens than what there is at that lens with a maximum aperture of f6.3. So my conclusion is this. This is an ironic kind of lens in that it is both expensive, 6,000 US dollars, 8,500 Canadian, that's a lot of money. However, it's also a huge bargain relative to the telephoto primes that it is able to match their maximum aperture is at those focal lengths. I would say that autofocus is good, though not Sony, G-Master high-end good. And so you're going to get plenty of autofocus to get all the keepers that you want, but not every single shot is going to be nailed. So just need to know that. In many ways, I have regretted Sony's artificial limitations on third-party lenses more on this lens than any lens before. If I could get the full burst rate of my Alpha 1, that would be amazing. Even more so, if I could use teleconverters on this lens, this is a lens that is begging for use with teleconverters, and the fact that we can't on Sony really feels pretty criminal at this point. This is an amazing lens. It's unique, it's special. I will say this. If you're going to shoot with this lens handheld on any kind of regular basis, you're going to need to build some muscle because this does take work. I did primarily shoot it handheld. However, I felt it for sure. My forearms have been aching a bit from carrying this thing around and shooting with it and hand holding it. Probably for many people, a better solution is going to be to use a monopod at the least, and maybe a robust tripod as well. However, this is a killer lens. I think that this is a great flagship lens for Sigma, and for those that are willing to spend the big bucks to get the high-end photos, I think it's going to make a lot of people very, very happy. Now, if you want more information, you can jump into my full text review that's linked in the description down below. There are buying links there as well. And if you want to look into that deep dive of the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. We'll jump into it together.
So we'll start by taking a look at the overall zoom range. So here's 300 millimeters versus 600 millimeters. You can see there's a lot of focus opportunities throughout there. Obviously, shooting across water, you're not going to necessarily get peak performance, but you can tell that this does deliver a very even performance, particularly at 300 millimeters. It looks great all across the frame. A little lower contrast at 600 millimeters, but that's also due to the fact that it's, just the effect of being over the water is affecting the image on the right more. Now, when it comes to vignette and distortion, it is just, you hardly see any difference between the two, and that's because there is the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion, so you can see a little inversion in this line. Straighten that out with a -2. Vignette is so low that I didn't hardly mess with it. I dialed in like a +12, and so that clears up that little bit in the corner. At 600 millimeters, there's just basically one percentage point more of the pincushion distortion. Again, it's very linear, straightens out just fine. Again, almost no vignette. I think I put a +13 in, but again, you could put nothing and you wouldn't really show up. At 300 millimeters, I see just a little bit of fringing before and after the plane of focus, nothing serious. And then at 600 millimeters, I would say there's a hair less. Nothing really here that you're going to have to worry about. It's very well corrected in that regard. Likewise with the lateral style chromatic aberrations, nothing to worry about. This is a lens, as I mentioned earlier, that just does a great job of correcting all the aberrations optically and not relying on electronics to do it. I've already given the caveat about outdoor testing, so I won't do that again. These results are at 200% magnification, and this is 300 millimeters. At 300 millimeters, center of the frame looks fantastic. Lots of detail, lots of contrast. Mid-frame looks fantastic. That's just perfect looking. Up here in the corner, just a little bit more softness, but still a lot of good detail, a little bit less contrast. And if we pop down to the bottom right corner, I would say if anything, that looks even better. So we've got a nice centering performance here as well, with good performance on both sides, all four corners. Now, when you're looking at 200% magnification, yes, you're going to see a little bit of improvement at f5.6 and, maybe even beyond that going into f8. But I mean, it's without having it side by side, let's just say it's a very incremental improvement. If you're looking at real-world results at just a more typical 100% magnification, there's all the sharpness there that you could want. It looks fantastic. Likewise in this shot, even though it's high-speed action, you can see there's tons of detail and no aberration showing up. It's just a really great-looking result. There's a hair bit of a build through f8. At f11, there's a very tiny regression due to diffraction. By f22, however, that diffraction regression is much more obvious. We've lost both contrast and detail. Now, if we compare 300 millimeters to 400 millimeters on the right, you can see that there's even more detail and contrast wide open at 400 millimeters. And I really noticed that difference up here in the corner where it is just amazingly consistent all across the frame. We're talking about a performance here in the corner that is very similar to the center performance at f4. So 400 millimeters, you're going to be delighted with the images you get from f4 on. At 500 millimeters, there's a little bit less contrast at f4 here on the left. By f5.6, if you stop down a bit, we've basically gained back all the lost contrast. So it's looking as good as what we have seen previously, I would say, particularly at 300 millimeters. Though as we get towards like the corners, they're good, but, and obviously better at f5.6. I'm not sure quite as good as what we saw at 400 millimeters, though, stop down to f5.6, it's close. At 500 millimeters, here you can see that, even wide open f4, there's plenty of detail there at 100% magnification for real shots. It looks great. At 600 millimeters, it's basically the same pattern, a little bit lower contrast, but by f5.6, you're getting that contrast back, and it's looking quite good once again. Up in the corners are maybe not as crisp as what we got to at 500 millimeters f5.6, but very, very close. It would be a splitting hairs difference. For real world perspective, once again, this is 600 millimeters f4. And as you can see, there's nothing there to complain about. Tons of detail and contrast. It looks really, really fantastic. Even, while moving quickly in the area of focus, it looks really, really great, great detail. I'm reminded again of how weird it is that seagulls have like red eyeliner, but nonetheless, it does the job. Now we can see at minimum focus distance that 300 millimeters doesn't give you as much magnification as 600 millimeters, but what's interesting is that neither one of these is where the maximum magnification is. I think 300 millimeters is ever so slightly higher contrast and detail here, but really it is at the somewhat odd focal length of 470 millimeters that you get your highest level of magnification, and it is noticeably higher than even at 600 millimeters. Now, you're going to see a difference in how compressed backgrounds are at 300 millimeters versus 600 millimeters. As you can see here, the background looks flatter and just basically a swirl of color without any kind of definition at 600 millimeters. Even at 300 millimeters, though, I think that the bokeh looks really, really nice. That's something I think the lens does quite well. Depth of field is going to be just tiny, just a little tiny sliver at any kind of practical distance. And so obviously you can completely blur out a background. That's never going to be a problem. And that's true. You're seeing both 300 and 600 millimeters. If you're close enough to the subject, either one is going to obliterate a background. You can see here too, I was shooting from, maybe 30 feet away, 10 meter-ish. And the whole background, it's a very complex scene behind here, but you can see all you see is just, the color. So that's beautiful. Where I think it's much more useful is when you're at a greater distance, and like in this shot, where it looks like I'm kind of shooting almost against a set because, I got good detail here on the subject, but I'm a long distance away from this subject, probably a minimum of 15 meters, 50 feet or so. You can see that there's so much definition between the subject and the background. I wouldn't get anything like this shot if I was shooting with a slower lens. Likewise here, my distance to Nala was probably pretty close to 10 meters, 30 feet, a little over 30 feet. But the distance from her to these background subjects are just, a few meters. And so this is a terrible ratio under most settings, but you can see how that the background is really blurred out. And so it allows her to pop out and the background to kind of fade away. And that's the real value of a lens like this. So thanks for sticking around until the very end. I hope this has helped you out. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day and let the light in.